WQAD News 8, this is WQAD This Week.
Good morning. It's Sunday, July 9th. Thank you for joining us for News 8 This Week. I'm Jon Diaz. Late last month, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down a number of decisions, some addressing some very controversial issues. This morning, Professor Paul Baumgardner from Augustana College joins us to look at some of those more closely and how they impact us right here in the Quad Cities. Professor, thank you again, always, for taking the time to chat with us. The Supreme Court just came out with a number of decisions over the past couple weeks here. I want to talk about the major ones that were probably the most contentious, the ones that a lot of folks were focused on and would be familiar with. We don't necessarily need to go into each one individually, but when you look at those decisions, what are some of your takeaways from this?
Wow, so there are several decisions that the court rendered this term, which we're going to have to think about the long-term implications for. I'm thinking in particular of cases pertaining to voting rights, cases pertaining to the role of state legislatures within federal elections. There's a very important case pertaining to tribal rights in the United States. We also had controversial cases coming down pertaining to affirmative action in higher education. And as many young people are talking about over the past few days, there's also an important Supreme Court decision that struck down one of President Biden's initiatives pertaining to student scholarships and student aid, student assistance, right, waiving a large amount of student debt. So those are some of the big decisions that I think a lot of constitutional scholars are discussing right now, but also decisions that people are interested in follow-up cases that relate to kind of setting the parameters of how maximalist or how minimalist those effects will be, right? So I'm thinking in particular here of the affirmative action decision. There will be follow-up cases. In fact, there have already been a few lawsuits in the past few days that I think are going to put federal courts in a position to have to clarify the Supreme Court's ruling and kind of give it more meat and more context.
Is that one of the cases, because we were talking about this briefly before our interview started, is that one of the cases, the affirmative action one, that you see that has broad implications to a lot of people, including a lot of people here in the Quad Cities?
I'd say yes and no.
Okay.
First of all, the number of American colleges and universities that actually had race-based affirmative action programs in their admissions were actually quite small. Just over 100 colleges and universities had race-based affirmative action policies in place before the Supreme Court's ruling. That's a small percentage of the number of colleges and universities in the United States. But I think that in the years to come, we will see follow-up cases that will really dictate the nature of the precedent set down by the Supreme Court. For instance, what is this Supreme Court decision going to mean for hiring at colleges and universities, right? A faculty member, a staff member at those colleges and universities. Also, what does this mean for the provision of scholarships and aid packages? For instance, moving forward, could colleges and universities provide targeted aid packages to certain racial and ethnic groups? I think we'll see more cases coming forward.
When you look at some of these cases, in particular the controversial ones, 6-3 seemed to be the decision, the line, right? But there's plenty of other cases that were unanimously decided. What does that tell us about kind of what's going on with the justices and how they are agreeing or disagreeing?
That's a great question. I think that oftentimes we'll focus in on those closely divided Supreme Court decisions, 5-4 decisions, 6-3 decisions. We'll focus in on cases in which we can clearly say something like, oh, all the conservative justices viewed the Constitution this way, or all of the more liberal justices viewed the Constitution this way. But one thing that gets lost in that kind of analysis is exactly what you highlighted, which is the number of Supreme Court decisions that are actually unanimous, that are 9-0, or near unanimous, 8-1, or Supreme Court decisions where we see a split within the court, but the split isn't largely on ideological lines. So even in this term, we did see a handful of very important unanimous decisions on cases concerning religious rights. Even the tribal law case that I brought up earlier, which upheld ICWA, a very important federal statute protecting tribal rights when it came to adoption, it was not a 6-3 decision with the more conservative justices on one side and the more liberal justices on the other side. Yes, it is the case that there were a good number of controversial decisions that were rendered where we do see 6-3 decisions, but there were also very important statutory, administrative, constitutional law decisions that were rendered in which you can't tell a clear ideological story.
How does someone who does not have, like myself, a legal background, has no training in this, sort of assess what's happening within the court? And I am referencing sort of a poll that came out recently that said a lot of folks believe that the court is acting too politically, right? Is politically motivated as opposed to simply focused on the law. How does one look at this and then assess as accurately as possible what is happening, if that is in fact the case, or in fact it's not that?
So for a long time, national polling showed that the federal courts were actually the branch of the national government that had the greatest popular support, more popular support than the executive branch or the legislative branch. And even within the federal courts, there was a good degree of favorability for the Supreme Court. That has started to erode in recent years. Why it's begun to erode is a wonderful question for academics, right? But I think it is important to note that the Supreme Court, it's a political body, it's a political institution. To think that these justices are 10 steps removed from handling political questions or even rendering decisions that have political implications is a bit of a fiction. But what to do with that? What to do with that? We're currently in an era that's referred to as the Roberts Court, right? The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is John Roberts. People have lambasted the Roberts Court for being overly conservative. But before John Roberts was the Chief Justice of the court, the Chief Justice was a man by the name of Rehnquist. The Rehnquist Court was also chastised by some legal scholars for being overly activistic, for engaging in judicial activism. Before that, political conservatives derided a period of the court history from the 1950s to the 1960s called the Warren Court for being overly liberal. So I guess what I'm trying to communicate is for the past 75 years, there have been those on the political right that have been angry for the court for being overly ideological and not really holding fast to the law. But we've also had periods of Supreme Court history, recent Supreme Court history, in which political liberals have criticized the court for being too conservative, right? What to do about it is another question. And I think this is where there have been fruitful discussions. There are some that are arguing that meaningful reforms need to be imposed on the federal courts or even the Supreme Court in particular. And we can discuss those possibilities as well. One thing that does come to mind is the Federalist Papers, and one Federalist paper in particular in which Alexander Hamilton made the argument that the weakest of the branches and the least dangerous of the branches would be the federal judiciary, right? That the new Constitution was going to set in place a degree of judicial independence and also ensure that the justices were not overly political. We were going to ensure that this branch of the government did not have the power of the purse, they didn't have the power of the sword, and we were able to immunize them from political influence, right? We were going to ensure that these individuals were not elected, we were going to give them lifetime tenure, and we were going to provide some important guardrails for this institution. I think more and more Americans are starting to question that. Is this the least powerful branch of the national government? Is this the least dangerous branch? Or have things changed?
Well, they have tremendous influence
Yeah.
on our daily lives.
Mm-hmm.
So does that sort of answer that question?
They have
Or
tremendous
perhaps
influence.
Not enough.
They have tremendous influence on our daily lives, as do the other branches of the federal government, and as do state entities. Right? We live in a federalist system in which both the federal government has rights, powers, and responsibilities over our lives, but we also have state governments, municipal governments with rights, powers, and responsibilities over our daily lives. I think the question that we should be asking ourselves is whether or not the kind of power that the federal courts wield today is an unchecked power and is an unaccountable power. Are there democratic practices that can address, that can respond to that court decision? Or is this a wayward institution that our system of checks and balances no longer fits, no longer addresses well?
Good questions to ask, I suppose, and good ways to sort of address some of this kind of controversy and division that we see.
Yeah.
All right, Professor, thanks so much for taking the time, as always.
Thank you.